My name is Elaine, and the moment I saw my husband standing too close to my younger brother's fiancée, I knew my life had just split in two. It wasn't a dramatic place. No hotel room, no dark alley. It was the parking lot behind the community center where the wedding rehearsal was supposed to happen later that evening. The asphalt was still damp from melting snow, and the air smelled faintly of salt from the road crews that never quite finished their work in March. I had come early to drop off centerpieces. I'd made myself simple arrangements in mason jars, white carnations, and sprigs of pine, nothing fancy. I believed in keeping things modest. That was how we'd lived our life in Kingston, Ontario. Modest, predictable, safe. Then I saw them. My husband Richard had his hand on her arm. Not a casual touch. Not the polite kind you use when you're guiding someone through a doorway. His fingers rested there, as if they belonged, as if that place had always been his. She leaned in her head, tilted just enough that her hair brushed his shoulder. They didn't see me at first. They were too busy whispering. I felt the blood drain from my face, but my body didn't move. I stood there with the box of centerpieces cutting into my palms, the cold creeping up through the soles of my boots. I remember thinking absurdly that I should have worn my warmer coat. I took a step forward. I was ready to confront him right there, in that ordinary parking lot under the flickering light near the recycling bins. 27 years of marriage rose up in my chest, like a wave demanding words, demanding answers. I began. Before my voice could reach them, a hand closed around my sleeve. "Elaine, don't," my brother Mark said quietly. I hadn't heard him approach. He stood beside me, now his face pale, but steady, his eyes fixed on the same scene. He leaned close, his breath warm against my ear. "I already know," he whispered. "And this, it's more than you think." That was the moment the ground truly shifted. Later, when I replay that day in my mind, as I still do more often than I care to admit, I realize how much happened in silence, how much meaning passed without words. Mark gently took the box from my hands and set it down on the bumper of his truck. He guided me away from the light and toward the edge of the lot where the snowbanks were piled high and the shadows were thick. Richard and his fiancée, Claire, drove off without ever looking back. I wanted to scream. I wanted to chase after them and demand the truth. Instead, I followed my younger brother to his truck and sat in the passenger seat while the heater rattled to life. My hands shook so badly I had to sit on them. Mark didn't say anything at first. He stared through the windshield at the empty lot, his jaw tight. "Tell me," I said finally. My voice sounded thin, like it didn't quite belong to me. He exhaled slowly. "I found out a few months ago." The words landed heavy between us. How I asked. Little things he said. Her phone lighting up late at night. Richard offering to help with wedding expenses when I hadn't asked. Money questions that didn't make sense. He swallowed. I didn't want to believe it. Neither did I. Richard and I had built our life carefully. We bought our first townhouse, with help from both sets of parents, and paid off the mortgage early by living frugally. We took one vacation a year, usually somewhere within driving distance, Prince Edward County, the Laurentians, once as far as Cape Breton when the kids were younger. We kept our savings in RRSPs, met with a financial planner every few years, and prided ourselves on being prepared. I had trusted that man with everything. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Mark looked at me, then really looked, and I saw the pain there mirrored by something else, determination. "Because I needed to be sure," he said, "and because I needed to protect you." Protect me. The words felt strange. I was the older sister, the one who used to drive him to hockey practice and help him study for exams. Yet here, he was steady when I was unraveling. "There's more," he said quietly. "It's not just an affair." The truck hummed around us, the radio murmuring the afternoon news. Somewhere nearby, a door slammed. Life went on indifferent to the small collapse happening inside me. "What do you mean?" I asked. Mark reached into the center console and pulled out a folded envelope. Inside were copies of bank statements and notes scribbled in his careful handwriting. "Richard's been advising Claire about money," he said. "About investments. About borrowing against future assets. He's been pushing ideas that don't sit right." My stomach clenched. "He told her he could help her secure a better future," Mark continued. "For both of them." For both of them. The implication was clear, and it stole what little air I had left. "So what do we do?" I asked. Mark met my eyes. "We don't make a scene," he said. "Not yet. We gather facts. We stay calm. And we make sure the truth comes out the right way." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tear the plan apart with my anger. But something in his voice, measured, careful, made me pause. "All right," I said at last. "For now." That night, I went home to the same house I'd shared with Richard for decades. I made dinner. I asked him about his day. I watched his face as he lied to me with the ease of long practice. When I went to bed, I lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, and wondered how something so solid could feel so fragile. By morning, I knew one thing for certain. The woman who had walked into that parking lot the day before was gone. And whatever came next would require patience I wasn't sure I possessed. Mark came by the next afternoon with 2 coffees and the kind of quiet purpose that told me he hadn't slept much either. I recognized that look. It was the same expression he used to wear the day before a big exam, when he'd sit at the kitchen table with his notes spread out, determined to get through it, no matter what. He set the cups down on my counter, glanced toward the living room, where Richard was supposed to be working from home, and lowered his voice. "He's on a call," Mark murmured. "I heard him. He won't come out for a while." I nodded. I had learned in the space of one night how to move through my own house like a guest. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where our children had done homework, where we'd hosted Thanksgiving dinners, where Richard had once held my hand when my mother passed away. It felt wrong that something so ordinary could now be the center of a secret. "Tell me everything you know," I said. Mark wrapped both hands around his coffee, as if he needed the warmth. "Okay," he said, "but you have to promise me something first." "What?" "No rash moves," he said. "No confronting him alone. No calling Claire. Not yet." I wanted to refuse out of pure stubbornness. But the memory of that parking lot, Richard's hand on Claire's arm, the way they had driven off without looking back, kept me grounded. "I promise," I said, though it tasted bitter. Mark opened the envelope again, this time, laying the papers out in a neat stack. He had highlighted a few lines in yellow. "This started when Claire asked Richard about a down payment," he said. "She was talking about you and him helping us after the wedding. I didn't want help, Elaine. I never asked for it." My throat tightened. Richard offered. Mark nodded. He acted like it was his idea, like he was being generous. But then things got specific. He tapped the highlighted lines. He suggested she take a loan before the wedding, said it would be easier if she had support behind her. He used words like security and future. He kept steering the conversation toward what you and he own. A cold, sharp fear ran through me. Our home was in my name, as well as Richard's, but the cottage property we'd inherited from his aunt, our little place near the Rideau, was mostly tied to him. We had always talked about updating the will, but like many couples, we kept putting it off. Life got busy. Things seemed stable. We assumed we had time. Why would Claire listen to him? I asked. Mark's mouth tightened. Because she trusts him, he said. And because she thinks he has money. She thinks he knows what he's doing. My mind flashed to Claire's polite smile, the way she'd called me Elaine, in that careful, slightly formal way. She was 32, I think. A nurse at the hospital. Practical, capable. Not the sort of woman I would have pictured chasing a married man. What makes you think it's more than just this? I asked, forcing the word affair to stay unspoken. Mark hesitated. Then he pulled out his phone and opened a note. Because I heard them talking, he said, not everything, but enough. He read from his screen quietly. Richard said, after the wedding, we'll sort it out. It'll be simpler once your name is on things. I stared at him. On things I repeated. Mark nodded. Claire asked, what if Elaine finds out? And he said, Mark's voice tightened, and for a moment, I saw the younger brother I used to protect. He said, she won't, and if she does, she'll be too embarrassed to do anything. My hands went cold. Too embarrassed. As if my dignity, my age, my life were tools he could use to keep me quiet. Mark put his phone down. I wanted to confront him. Then he admitted. But I didn't. I started paying attention instead. And Claire, I asked. Mark's gaze dropped. I don't know what she truly feels, he said. Some days she seems nervous, like she's trying to convince herself. Other days she acts perfectly normal. A quiet ache spread through my chest, not just for myself, but for Mark. He was my little brother, but he wasn't little anymore. He had been planning a life with this woman. He had introduced her to our family. He had stood up for her when our aunt made that pointed comment about her being too modern. He loved her. So what's the plan? I asked again. Mark drew in a breath. We gather proof, he said. The kind that matters. Not rumors, not feelings, facts. I stared at the papers, the lines and numbers blurred. Proof of what? I asked. Proof that Richard's not just cheating, Mark said. Proof that he's trying to move money pressure. Claire, maybe even pressure me into a situation where he benefits. I don't know if he's planning fraud or just manipulation, but I'm not letting him ruin you. And I'm not walking into a marriage built on lies. The steadiness in his voice did something to me. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave it shape. It gave me a way to move forward. I nodded slowly. All right, I said. Tell me what you need me to do. Mark's eyes softened. First, he said, we protect you, quietly. He slid one paper closer. It was a list he had made. Change your online banking passwords, he said. Check your credit report. Make sure no one's opened anything in your name. I blinked. You think Richard would? I don't know, Mark interrupted gently. But I didn't think he would do what he's already done either. He was right. The man I thought I knew had become a stranger. Second, Mark continued. We talked to a family lawyer, not for a divorce right away, just to understand where you stand. And we meet with a financial planner, someone independent, someone who doesn't know Richard. I imagined walking into an office downtown, sitting across from someone in a suit, explaining that my husband might be using my own life as a bargaining chip with my brother's fiancée. The humiliation rose up, hot and sharp. Then I heard Richard's words in my mind. She'll be too embarrassed to do anything. No? Okay, I said quietly. Mark gave a small nod. Third, he said, we watch and document. Not secretly recording everything, not doing anything illegal, but keeping a timeline. If he's moving funds, we'll see it. If he's pushing Claire, we'll see it. I swallowed. And the wedding? Mark's jaw clenched. The wedding stays on the calendar, he said. For now. For now, I repeated. Mark reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was firm. Elaine, he said, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I wish I could take this away. I looked at my brother, his tired eyes, the faint stubble along his jaw, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of what he'd learned, and something in me steadied. We'll handle it, I said, surprising myself with the calm in my voice. We'll handle it properly. In the living room, Richard laughed softly at something on his call. The sound made my stomach turn. Mark squeezed my hand once more and let go. I'll book the lawyer, he said. And Elaine? Yes. He leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. If Richard tries to talk you into anything selling, signing, borrowing, say no, no matter how smooth he sounds. I nodded. After Mark left, I stood at the kitchen sink and stared out at the backyard, where the snow was thinning to reveal patches of brown grass. The world looked exactly the same as it had a week ago. The same street, the same neighbors, walking their dogs, the same winter sun, hanging low and pale. But inside me, everything had shifted. I wasn't just a betrayed wife anymore. I was a woman who was going to learn the truth and make sure it didn't destroy the people who had done nothing wrong. The following week moved with a strange double rhythm. On the surface, life continued as usual. Richard made coffee in the mornings and complained about the price of groceries. He asked whether I'd mailed the final RSVP cards and reminded me to pick up his dry cleaning. If I hadn't known what I knew, I might have believed we were still the same couple we'd always been. Underneath, everything felt sharpened. I began to notice details I would once have dismissed. Richard's phone never left his side. He stepped outside to take calls, even though the weather had turned bitter again. When I asked casual questions about work, about Mark and Claire, his answers were smooth, but oddly rehearsed. I kept my promise to Mark. I didn't confront. I observed. The first appointment was with a family lawyer in downtown Kingston, recommended by a neighbor who'd gone through a quiet separation years earlier. The office was modest, tucked above a pharmacy, with a view of Princess Street and its steady stream of buses and pedestrians. I sat in the waiting room, with my hands folded in my lap, feeling older than my years. The lawyer, Ms. Patel, listened without interruption as I explained my situation. I spoke, carefully sticking to facts: long marriage, shared assets, suspected financial manipulation, possible infidelity involving a family member. When I finished, she nodded once. You did the right thing by coming early, she said. Knowledge is protection. She walked me through the basics: what was jointly owned, what wasn't, how assets could be frozen if necessary. She explained that emotional betrayal and financial risk often traveled together, especially when secrecy was involved. Do not sign anything you don't fully understand, she said, and don't agree to temporary arrangements without advice. Temporary. Richard loved that word. Just temporary, Elaine. Just until things settle. I left the office with a thin folder under my arm and a heaviness in my chest, but also a sense of footing I hadn't felt since that parking lot. The financial planner came next. Mark arranged the meeting with someone in Ottawa, far enough removed from our social circle to avoid complications. We met over video, Mark in his apartment, and me in the spare bedroom with the door closed. The planner, a calm woman with gray-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses, reviewed our documents methodically. S, P's, T, F, S, As. The cottage deed. Lines of credit. There's no immediate disaster here, she said, after a long pause. But there is vulnerability. That word again. She pointed out how easily one ill-advised loan or co-signature could entangle multiple people, how pressure, especially within families, often led to decisions people later regretted. Transparency matters, she said, especially at your stage of life. After the call ended, Mark stayed on the line. I hate this, he said quietly, dragging you into meetings, making you worry. You didn't drag me, I replied. You warned me. We began keeping a shared timeline. Nothing dramatic, dates, conversations, amounts. When Richard mentioned helping with wedding costs, I noted it. When Claire asked about consolidating expenses, Mark wrote it down. When Richard moved a small sum between accounts, to simplify things, I recorded the date and amount. It felt clinical, necessary. One evening, while Richard showered, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The notification banner was enough. Can we talk tonight? I'm nervous. Claire. My hands trembled, but I stayed where I was. When Richard came out wrapped in a towel, he scooped up the phone and turned it face down without looking at me. That night, lying beside him, I listened to his breathing and wondered when the distance between us had grown so vast. A few days later, Mark called me in the afternoon. She asked me something, he said. What I asked, already bracing myself. She asked whether we could push the wedding back, he said. Just a bit. She said, things felt rushed. My heart thudded. What did you say? I told her we could talk, he said, that I wanted to understand what she needed. There was a long pause on the line. Elaine, Mark said finally, I don't think she's as certain as Richard thinks she is. That knowledge didn't bring relief. It brought complexity. Claire wasn't a faceless villain. She was a woman caught in something that had grown beyond her control. A few days later, I saw proof that made my stomach drop. Richard sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, papers spread out around him. When he noticed me watching, he smiled. I'm just reviewing some numbers, he said casually, helping Mark and Claire plan responsibly. I nodded, said nothing. But later, when he stepped out to take another call, I looked at the page he'd left behind. It was a draft email, unsent. I think it would be simpler after the wedding, it read. Once names are aligned, banks are more flexible. Names aligned. I took a photo with my phone and put the paper back exactly where it had been. That night, I added a new entry to the timeline. The closer we got to the wedding date, the quieter Mark became. He still showed up, still followed the plan, but I could hear the strain in his voice. This wasn't just strategy for him. It was grief. One afternoon, he stopped by unexpectedly. He stood in my doorway, his coat still on. I keep thinking about what I missed, he said, about whether I ignored signs because I wanted things to work. I stepped aside and let him in. This isn't your fault, I said. You trusted someone you loved. He looked at me, then eyes red-rimmed. So did you. We sat together in the living room, not speaking, the house filled with the ticking of the clock we'd bought on a trip to Quebec years ago. Time kept moving indifferent to our careful planning. By the end of that week, we had enough. Not for accusations, for action. The evidence wasn't explosive, but it was solid. Patterns, intent, pressure. Enough to ask questions in the right rooms. Mark called me one evening, his voice steady in a way it hadn't been for days. I think we're ready, he said. Ready for what I asked. To stop waiting, he replied, but not by shouting, by choosing when and how the truth comes out. I looked around my kitchen at the familiar counters, in the calendar still marked with the wedding date. Yes, I said quietly, we are. The morning of the wedding arrived, with the kind of calm that feels borrowed. The sky over Kingston was pale and clear, the St. Lawrence moving slowly beyond the tree line, as if it had all the time in the world. I stood at the kitchen window with a mug of tea I barely touched, listening to the hum of the fridge and the distant sound of a neighbor scraping ice from a windshield. Richard was already dressed when I came downstairs. Dark suit, pressed shirt, the same tie he'd worn to our daughter's graduation. He looked composed, almost pleased. "You ready?" he asked lightly. I nodded, as I'll ever be. That wasn't a lie, though not in the way he meant. Mark had insisted on keeping the day as normal as possible. No last-minute cancellations, no whispered warnings to relatives. The venue, a modest lakeside lodge just outside town, had been booked months earlier. Friends and family were traveling in from Ottawa, Toronto, even as far as Winnipeg. Stopping everything without explanation would have created a different kind of damage. We let the day unfold, Mark had said the night before, and we intervene where it matters. We arrived early. I helped arrange the last of the flowers, my hands steady, despite the tension humming beneath my skin. The room smelled of pine and coffee. Folding chairs were lined up in neat rows, programs stacked at the entrance. The officiant, a retired minister Mark and Claire both trusted, greeted me warmly. "Beautiful day for it," he said. "Yes," I replied, "it is." Mark arrived shortly after his expression, calm, almost serene. He met my eyes across the room and gave the smallest nod. We were aligned. Claire appeared later, escorted by her sister. She looked pale beneath her makeup, her smile fixed but fragile. When her gaze met mine, something flickered there. Fear, maybe, or recognition. She looked away quickly. The ceremony began on time. Guests settled. The officiant spoke about commitment and honesty, about building a life on trust. I listened carefully, each word landing with unexpected weight. As the vows approached, Mark raised his hand slightly. "Before we continue," he said, his voice clear but respectful, "there's something that needs to be addressed." A ripple moved through the room. Richard stiffened beside me. Mark turned to the officiant. "May we step aside for a moment?" The officiant hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." Mark gestured toward a small side room off the main hall. "Just those involved," he said quietly. "Please." The room emptied slowly. Mark, Claire, Richard, the officiant, and me. The door closed behind us, muting the murmur of guests outside. Mark didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply laid out the facts one by one in the careful order we'd rehearsed. Over the past several months, he began, there have been conversations and actions that affect this marriage and our family. Before vows are exchanged, they need to be acknowledged. Claire's hands trembled. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but Mark held up a hand. "Let me finish," he said calmly. He referenced dates, conversations, financial suggestions that crossed boundaries. He mentioned the pressure Claire had felt, the promises that had been made, the implications of names aligning. Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered. "I thought he was helping." Richard finally spoke. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said. "I was just offering guidance." "Guidance that benefited you," I said quietly. He turned to me, then surprise, flashing across his face. "Elaine." "No," I said, my voice steady. "Not here. Not like this." The officiant cleared his throat gently. It seems there are unresolved matters, he said. Perhaps the ceremony should be postponed. Claire nodded immediately. Yes, she said. I need time. Mark looked at her pain etched across his face, but he didn't argue. Time is fair, he said. Outside, the announcement was made with dignity. The wedding was postponed due to personal matters. Guests were offered coffee and lunch apologies delivered without details. There was confusion, disappointment, but also understanding. People sensed something serious had been avoided. Richard was furious. I could see it in the tight set of his jaw as we drove home in silence. That evening, Mark called. It's done, he said. At least the first part. Yes, I replied. Now comes the rest. The following days were a blur of quiet consequences. Mark met with his bank advisor and withdrew any pending applications. Claire sought independent financial advice and moved in temporarily with her sister. The officiant documented the postponement, formally ensuring no legal commitments had been made. Richard tried to regain control. He suggested counseling. He spoke of misunderstandings. He implied that embarrassment should push us toward forgiveness and silence. But I was finished being guided by his convenience. I met again with Ms. Patel. We discussed options calmly. Separation, asset protection, boundaries. I want clarity, I said, not revenge. She nodded. Clarity is powerful. One evening, as Richard packed a bag to stay with a friend, he stopped in the doorway. I never meant to hurt you, he said. I looked at him, really looked, and felt something settle. Intent doesn't erase impact, I said, and trust doesn't survive secrecy. He left without another word. Weeks later, Mark and I sat by the water, the ice finally breaking along the shoreline. Claire had reached out to him, not to reconcile, but to apologize. She was taking time to understand her own choices. I don't know what comes next, Mark said quietly. Neither do I replied. But at least it's honest. The wedding that never happened became a quiet turning point. Not a scandal, not a spectacle, just a moment when truth was given room to breathe. And that I learned was enough to change everything. The house felt quieter once Richard was gone. Not empty, just stripped of attention I hadn't realized had become constant. I moved through the rooms differently, no longer bracing myself for explanations or watching my words. The silence wasn't peaceful yet, but it was honest. The days after the postponed wedding unfolded without drama, exactly as Mark had hoped. There were no raised voices, no public accusations. Instead, consequences arrived in envelopes, emails, and scheduled meetings. Richard called twice that first week. I didn't answer. On the third call, I listened. I've spoken to someone at the bank, he said quickly, as if momentum might work in his favor. We can smooth this over. There's no need to involve lawyers or make this harder than it already is. I already have, I replied. There was a pause. Elaine, he said, lowering his voice, people our age don't start over lightly. I'm not starting over, I said. I'm standing still and looking clearly. He sighed, frustrated. You're letting Mark turn this into something it isn't. I felt a familiar flicker of anger, then let it pass. Mark didn't create this, I said. He uncovered it. After that, Richard stopped calling. Mark and I met with the financial planner again, this time in person. She reviewed the updated situation with care, confirming that no joint obligations had been triggered. The relief in Mark's shoulders was visible. You did the right thing by slowing everything down, she told him. Rushed decisions are expensive. Claire sent me a letter, a real one, handwritten. She didn't excuse herself. She didn't blame Richard entirely. She wrote about confusion, about trusting someone older, and assuming experience meant wisdom. "I'm ashamed," she wrote, "not just for what I almost did, but for not asking better questions sooner." I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in my desk drawer. Forgiveness, I was learning, didn't have to be immediate to be sincere. The next step was practical. Ms. Patel helped me file the necessary paperwork to separate our finances cleanly. It wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. Accounts were split according to law. The cottage was protected until a fair decision could be made. Nothing vanished overnight. Everything was documented. When Richard finally came to collect the rest of his things, he moved through the house like a guest, unsure of the rules. He paused in the doorway of the spare room. "I never thought you'd be this calm," he said. "I've had time to think," I replied. He nodded, then hesitated. "Do you hate me?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said, "but I don't trust you, and that matters more." He left quietly. Mark struggled more than he admitted. The loss of the wedding, even a wedding he now knew was wrong, carried weight. We walked together most evenings, along the waterfront, the path familiar from years of family strolls. "I keep replaying conversations," he said one night, "wondering what I missed." "You didn't miss anything," I said. "You trusted. That's not a flaw." He stopped walking and looked at me. "You're stronger than I realized." I smiled faintly. "So are you." Word spread in the careful Canadian way, never directly, never with embellishment. People asked if everything was all right. We said it was complicated, but handled. Most nodded and let it rest. One afternoon, I ran into a neighbor at the grocery store. "I heard the wedding was postponed," she said gently. "I hope you're okay." "I am," I replied and meant it. Weeks passed. The snow melted completely. Spring edged in, tentative but determined. Mark returned to his routines. Claire moved to another city for a short-term contract, needing distance. We didn't know if they'd ever find their way back to each other, and for the first time, we didn't try to decide for them. As for me, I began attending a community lecture series at the library talks on retirement planning, legal rights, later life transitions. I sat among people my age, listening, learning. It felt grounding, empowering. One speaker said something that stayed with me. Justice doesn't have to be loud to be effective. That night, I wrote it down. Richard emailed once more months later. A careful message, regretful, but still vague. "I hope someday you'll understand," he wrote. I closed the message without replying. Understanding, I had learned, wasn't about accepting excuses. It was about seeing patterns clearly and choosing differently. Mark joined me for dinner one Sunday, bringing soup from his favorite place downtown. We ate at the same kitchen table where all this had begun. "I don't feel broken anymore," he said quietly. I reached across and squeezed his hand. "Neither do I." There was no celebration, no dramatic victory. Just the steady return of balance. Lives redirected before they could be damaged beyond repair. And that, I realized, was consequence enough. Spring settled in fully. By the time I realized how much energy I'd been spending, simply holding myself together. The air softened, the days lengthened, and with the change came a quiet invitation to consider what healing might look like, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a series of deliberate choices. Mark was the first to suggest counseling, not in a grand way. We were walking along the path near Lake Ontario, the water finally free of ice, when he mentioned it almost in passing. "I've booked a few sessions," he said. "For myself." I glanced at him. "How do you feel about that?" Relieved, he admitted, and tired, but mostly relieved. That honesty mattered. It made it easier to admit what I'd been avoiding. I might do the same, I said. I did a week later. The counselor's office was bright and unassuming, tucked between a bakery and a small insurance firm. We spoke about long marriages, about the shock of discovering that trust can erode quietly, and about the particular grief of betrayal later in life when people assume you should be beyond such upheaval. You're allowed to take this seriously, she told me. Age doesn't make pain smaller. Those words stayed with me. Richard and I met once, at the suggestion of our lawyers, to discuss practical matters and to close what needed closing. It was a mediated meeting, calm and structured. We spoke about the house, about timelines, about respectful distance. There were apologies, not the kind that fix everything, but the kind that acknowledge damage. I didn't realize how much I was risking, he said at one point. I met his gaze. You did? I replied. You just decided it was worth it. He didn't argue. We agreed on boundaries that made sense. Separate lives, clear communication channels, no revisiting the past unless it served understanding, not leverage. When the meeting ended, I felt lighter, not because I'd won anything, but because the ambiguity had lifted. Mark's healing took a different shape. He focused on routine, work, exercise, long phone calls with friends who didn't ask for details, but listened when he offered them. He and Claire exchanged a few messages over time, careful and honest. They met once for coffee in a public place to say what needed to be said. It didn't end with reconciliation. It ended with clarity. I don't regret loving her, Mark told me afterward, but I'm glad I didn't marry into confusion. That was a kind of wisdom you don't rush into. As for Claire, she wrote again, months later. Another letter, this one steadier. She spoke about learning to question advice, especially when it comes wrapped in authority. She thanked me for not making her the villain of a story she hadn't fully written. I wrote back briefly, kindly, with boundaries. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't a single act. It was a posture, one that didn't require closeness to remain intact. Summer arrived quietly. I spent more time at the cottage, leading small repairs I'd once left to Richard. Fixing a loose railing, repainting the porch. The work was physical and satisfying. Each task completed felt like a small reclaiming. One afternoon, Mark joined me. We sat on the steps with iced tea, watching the water ripple in the late light. I used to think justice meant someone losing, he said. And now I asked. Now I think it means fewer people getting hurt, he replied. I smiled. That felt right. We talked about the future in practical terms. Wills updated. Powers of attorney reviewed. Conversations we'd once postponed, now handled directly, without fear. There was something grounding about preparation that wasn't rooted in anxiety. I don't want to be caught unprepared again, Mark said. Neither do I agreed. By autumn, the rhythm of my life had changed. Not drastically, just enough to feel intentional. I joined a book club at the library, volunteered once a week at a community program that helped seniors navigate paperwork and planning. I listened to stories that echoed my own in unexpected ways. So many people waited too long to ask questions, too long to protect themselves. One evening after a meeting, a woman my age pulled me aside, known only to me as Margaret from Tuesdays. Thank you, she said, for explaining things plainly. I nodded, understanding more than she knew. Mark and I gathered for Thanksgiving with a smaller group than usual. No tension, no pretending, just food warmth and honest conversation. At one point, Mark raised his glass. To doing things properly, he said. I raised mine, to doing them with care. There was still loss. That doesn't disappear, but it no longer defined us. Healing, I discovered, wasn't about returning to who I'd been before. It was about becoming someone steadier, more attentive, and less willing to surrender clarity for comfort. And that felt like a kind of reconciliation with myself, first of all. By the time winter returned, I no longer measured my days by what had been lost. I measured them by what felt solid. Snow fell early that year, softening the edges of the street and quieting the neighborhood in a way only a Canadian winter can. I stood at the front window one evening, watching the lights come on one by one, and realized I felt calm, not numb, calm. The kind that settles when you stop arguing with reality and start living honestly inside it. Mark came by the following weekend carrying a folder under his arm. I updated everything he said, setting it on the table. Will, power of attorney, beneficiaries. I smiled. I did the same. We laughed softly at the symmetry of it. Not bitter laughter, just recognition. I used to think these conversations were pessimistic, he said, like you were inviting trouble by planning for it. And now I asked. Now I think they're acts of care, he replied. For yourself, for the people you love. That more than anything felt like the lesson hidden inside everything we'd been through. Richard and I finalized the last details of our separation shortly before the holidays. It was done respectfully, without courtroom drama. We shook hands at the end, not as partners, not even as friends, but as two people acknowledging an ending without cruelty. I hope you're well, he said. I am, I replied, and again I meant it. On Christmas morning, Mark and I shared breakfast at my place. Simple food, strong coffee, snow piled high outside. There was no sense of absence, no awkward gap where something was supposed to be, just presence. Later that day, I took a walk through the neighborhood, bundled against the cold. I passed houses where families gathered others, where lights glowed quietly behind curtains. Every life carried its own unseen weight. I understood that better now. When I think back to that parking lot behind the community center, the damp pavement, the flickering light, I no longer feel the sharp sting I once did. I feel clarity, because that moment, painful as it was, stopped something far worse from taking root. It taught me this betrayal doesn't always arrive to destroy you. Sometimes it arrives to wake you up. For anyone listening who recognizes pieces of their own life in this story, I want to say something plainly without drama. Ask questions. Protect what you've built. Don't confuse silence with dignity. And don't let embarrassment keep you from seeking advice. Lawyers, financial planners, counselors, they exist to help you navigate moments like these, not to judge you for needing them. Revenge doesn't have to be loud to be effective. Sometimes it looks like clarity. Sometimes it looks like boundaries. And sometimes it looks like stopping harm before it becomes irreversible. Mark and I didn't win anything tangible. We didn't celebrate, but we kept our integrity, our finances, and our sense of self intact. We chose care over chaos, and in the end, that choice gave us peace. If this story gave you something to reflect on about trust family, or the quiet strength of doing things properly, I invite you to hold on to that. Share it with someone who might need it. And if you want to hear more stories grounded in real-life stories that value dignity as much as truth, I hope you'll stay and listen again.